The following talk is offered freely to ensure that no one is ever denied access to these practices and to these teachings. If you feel inspired to make a donation to support this offering, you can go to my website at jonathanfoust.com. While you're there, you can also sign up for a monthly newsletter designed to support you in your practice. Thank you, and enjoy.
I'd like to talk a little bit tonight about a component of the practice which is really critical to being more alive, and that is the cultivation of compassion. It's so easy, I don't know about you, but it's so easy these days to find myself kind of shutting down and in judgment of lots of people. And part of the question is, how do we keep our hearts open in times of such turmoil? Quite often, when I give a talk on, how to transform your relationship to anxiety, I'll get an anxiety attack, that week, or, how to work with depression, I'll feel depressed that week. And I thought, what, I'm only going to talk about happiness from now on. And then of course, I give a talk on happiness, and then I feel my sadness. And so this talk on compassion, I'm happy to say, I felt really good this week. And I've actually had lots of memories of moments of feeling compassion. And I was really kind of struck by one instance in particular. As I've often shared, in my youthful idiocy many, many years ago, after being in the Peace Corps, I thought it'd be a great idea to ride my bicycle across the Sahara Desert. And I tried. And I took off, and the hot season was terrible, and the Harmattan winds were terrible, and I got really sick. I was getting chronic nosebleeds from the dust, and biking on dirt roads, and like 90 kilometers between water, and carrying all my water, and I was really just blown out, completely blown out. And one of the really nice things, when I had met this fellow who had once biked in the Sahara, he said, don't worry about supplies. Everyone stops to see how you're doing, because it's such a crazy thing to see someone on a bike out there. So I was really feeling like I just can't do this anymore. And then this Land Rover pickup truck just pulled over. And these two wild Brazilian guys on safari, came up, and we didn't speak any language in common, but they could just see that I was really, really sick. And without hardly any words, they just loaded my bike in the back of their truck, and I got to ride back on a dirt road in the back of a pickup truck, but nonetheless, there was something about just not having a language, but them sensing my suffering and just responding. And just as I've thought about it this week, it's just been such a really, really beautiful memory of having someone sense my struggle and respond. And there's a difference between empathy and compassion. Empathy would be them saying, wow, I really get you're feeling sick and run down. And compassion is, let me help you load your stuff in the back of the truck and take you back. Compassion is the response to suffering. It's sometimes described as the quickening of the heart in response to suffering. So I'd like to talk a little bit about how the practice of compassion is part of a training of the mind and heart, of cultivating these qualities of immeasurable heartfulness. And to talk a little bit of how we practice that towards self in expanding circles. And also to talk a little bit about the challenges and the pitfalls, because it's a training. And there are lots of ways that we can either fall short or misinterpret the practice. When you go on a formal retreat and you take what are called the precepts, which are sort of the agreements that you're committing to create the most harmonious retreat that you can. The classic phrase is that I agree to undertake the training. I agree to undertake the training of non-harming. I agree to undertake the training of... And I love that language, because when you're exploring meditation and mindfulness and what it means to be awake, you are undertaking a training. And you're undertaking the trainings that lead to wisdom, to help you see more clearly what's real. This is an investigation into reality. But you're also undertaking a training to train your heart, to train your capacity to hold what you find and what you see. One definition of compassion, it's the conscious resonance with suffering and the action in response to suffering. So I've had this week to think about this, and I've had so many moments when I've been touched by actions in response to suffering. I was thinking about when I lived in Western Massachusetts, heating my house with wood. I had pneumonia, pretty bad pneumonia. And some friends, Bharat and Kunti, just showed up one day and brought in all the wood I needed for a week and stacked it next to my stove as I just sort of lay there watching. What a profound moment that was. I was traveling alone in Europe once, and everything I owned was stolen. And I met this family who were on holiday, and they just took me in, and I became part of their family reunion for a week. That was really fun. I had so much fun. When my wife thinks I'm hungry and brings me a bowl of food, those moments of just receiving are so profound. So a short little reflection, if you like. You can close your eyes. And if you would, with your eyes closed, if you can just take a few moments to reflect on just some recent memory, some time when you were stressed or suffering or in need, and someone sensed that and responded to you. Just take a moment to sense if you can find a memory. If not, you can make one up. And as you think about it, just take a moment to sense, when you think about this, what does that feel like inside? Someone sensed your stress, your suffering, and they responded through their action. And just in your own way, letting this feeling know that you see it. This feeling of compassion, or as it's referred to in Pali and Sanskrit as karuna, is one of what's described as the immeasurable states of the heart. But if you really investigate that feeling of compassion, you may find that it's limitless. It doesn't have an edge. Part of this practice is to explore how you can cultivate that and grow that. So if you like, you can deepen the breath and you can let your eyes open, or feel free to remain with them closed. And these immeasurable states of the heart are all part of the training. And they have to do with kindness and compassion and joy. And the fourth is equanimity. It's a steadiness of heart that can hold anything and everything. And these states, again, when you really investigate them, when you really look closely at them, they open you into a quality of limitlessness. There is no edge to compassion, ultimately. And it goes very much against our nature, because we have this built-in negativity bias that's tied into our survival mechanism. So some part of our consciousness is constantly scanning for danger and scanning for anything that could be threatening to you. On the one hand, that scanning for danger it's a wisdom faculty, and because it's really looking for things that really could kill you in order to keep your organism alive and keep you moving toward what's most important in your life. And the other side of that coin is kind of the hypervigilance of anxiety. All of our hallucinations of the things that could kill us. Or as Mark Twain famously said, the worst things in my life never actually happened. You know, we have this capacity to manufacture stress. So part of this training in compassion goes somewhat against a baked-in quality of our survival instinct. And when you begin to really focus on compassion in your life, what naturally happens is you'll notice how you're not compassionate. You'll notice the judgments you have toward yourself and toward others. You'll notice all the ways you're envious and jealous and comparing. All the ways that you make yourself better than others or less than others. All of that comes in sharp relief when you begin to really contemplate what compassion really means and what compassion really feels like for you. And so the question becomes, is when you begin with a compassion practice, where do you start? I remember reading some story, I don't remember where it was, but it was someone describing what it was like when they grew up. And this is, a couple of generations ago. And this woman described being a little girl, and her father was a laborer. And he also hunted, to bring in extra meat. And he also cut wood on the sides. He was a very, very hardworking man. They had very, very little money. But she said how the meals, they were at so little that at the meals, their father would eat first until he was full. And then the rest of the family would eat what was left. On the one hand, that sounds, wow, what a narcissist. But on the other hand, he had to keep going. He needed the fuel in order to provide. He was a dedicated father. He lived simply by what his body was able to produce. And it's a really interesting element to look at. That if you have a desire to respond to the suffering in the world, if your cup is empty, you're not going to be very effective. So what we need to do is to learn how to fill the cup. And the classic line that many of us are familiar with is, when you're on an airplane, you're taught to, if you lose oxygen, you put the oxygen mask on yourself first before putting it on your child. So we have to look toward ourselves first. There's really no other way to do that. On the one hand, one side of the coin is you need to fill your cup so that you have the energy and the resources and the vitality and the clarity to meet the challenges. And the other side can sort of be a selfishness or a narcissism. Finding that balance is really challenging. And the tendency can be toward narcissism and self-protection. That's the nature of what the ego does. It reminds me of that story of a young woman in a museum who knocks over a $100,000 vase, and everyone is so shocked, and she says, it's okay, I'm all right. So when you begin to explore what it's like to fill your cup with compassion, for many of it's very, very challenging. There's the classic line from Garrison Keillor, when he said when he was in college, he wrote his parents a letter and said, "Dear Mom and Dad, I just want you to know you no longer have to criticize me. I've completely internalized your voices, and I'm doing it for you from now on." And so it becomes very interesting to sense of the negativity that you have taken on from an early age. I used to do these, when I did a lot of fundraising way a long time ago, I used to do these workshops, and we'd talk about our relationship to money. And one question I would always ask was, to complete the phrase, one thing my father always said about money is, if you can fill in that blank. And then ask yourself, how much is that statement still operative in your belief system right now? You know, we take on so many of these internal messages about not being enough or being too much. Either we're too loud, or we have too much energy, or we're too opinionated, or we're not athletic enough, we're not smart enough, we're not popular enough, we're not talented enough. All of that is kind of baked in. And when we begin to really, really slow down, we can begin to recognize the messages that we internalized and really explore their reality. You can imagine if these people really took the messages in, little Einstein saying, you're too quiet. Or Martha Graham, you're too restless, stop dancing around. Or Picasso, stop doodling. Or Buddha, you're asking too many questions. Generally, we have a sense of, I'm not enough, I'm not worthy enough, or there's something wrong. And so then the question really to explore, and we won't linger here because we're going to talk about expanding the circles, is to really explore what is it between holding yourself with compassion and kindness. This is really what the training points toward. And a couple of weeks ago, we talked about some of the strategies of just learning how to pause and just bring your hand to your heart, or just to find some words. I care about this stress. I care about this suffering. It's a way that we can begin to soften. Gandhi had a great line where he said, if there is to be peace in the world, there has to be peace in the nations. If there is to be peace in the nations, there has to be peace in the cities. If there will be peace in the cities, there must be peace in the neighborhoods. If there's peace in the neighborhoods, there has to be peace in the family. And if there is to be peace in the family, there has to be peace in the self. So our work is to find that in ourselves and then explore how we can begin to widen the circles a little bit. I was listening to NPR this morning, and of course now the fascination is what's going on in Iowa. And they were in, Iowa, I believe, is like 97% dominant culture, white culture. But there's one town of Davenport, apparently, where it's sort of like 50-50. And in one of the interviews, they were talking about what it's like, and one of the managers of this town told this story of how an older couple moved into town. They sold their farm, and they moved into Davenport. And then the houses all around them were bought by Hispanics. And they became really fearful of their neighbors. And one day, the 81-year-old guy was cleaning his gutters. He, put up his ladder and was up there cleaning the gutters. And a neighbor came over and said, "Get down, I do." And so he went up and cleaned this guy's gutters. And the wife was baking an apple pie. And she gave him an apple pie in gratitude for what he did. And that's how it works. I think that's how it works. We sense the suffering, the stress. We respond, and then something opens up inside. So classically, what we do in expanding the circles of compassion is we begin with ourselves, which of course, as we've talked about before, is quite often the hardest place to begin, because we tend to hold ourselves with so much judgment or contempt. But as we begin to fill that cup, we can then begin to explore how to expand the circles. And I shared this story before, but on a month-long retreat, when you do a month-long retreat, you spend some time every day on the hard practices. And a nice place to start, actually, is to think of your benefactors, of the people who are on your side, those who really, really want you to be well. And you sense what it's like to wish them well. Then you focus on yourself. And then you reflect on what's called a neutral person, someone you have no attraction or aversion toward. So we were told to choose someone for the week. And I chose our retreat manager, who struck me as a nice but unremarkable person. And so every day I would be just wishing her well and wishing her ease and sensing her goodness. And on about day 3 or day 4 in our retreat, she came into the meditation hall, and I felt my heart surge. Just my beloved has arrived. I started getting worried that I was falling in love with the retreat manager. But it's interesting how that works. The energy flows where the attention goes. And it's so interesting to kind of sense the neutral people that you have no attraction or aversion toward, and as you generate goodwill toward them, what can occur? Part of the practice is to expand it out to the challenging people, the difficult people. And whenever I kind of take this on, it's always interesting to me how when I really sense the people I really hold in judgment or maybe in contempt, and I can stay with that practice, I can really begin to sense how, if they were happy, if their cup was full, if their unmet needs were met, how much more wholesome their actions would be. Just as when my needs are met, when my heart is full, I respond spontaneously, that can be so for others. Ram Dass tells this great story. I'm going to give a talk next week on remembering Ram Dass. How way back when, part of his heart practices, on his altar, he was a very devotional guy. He was on a devotional path. How he had a photo, like an image of Hanuman and an image of Krishna, and then he had a photograph of Bob Dole, who was the head of the Senate. And he would sit down at his altar and he'd go, "Oh, Hanuman," and feel his heart connection. And Krishna, "Oh, Krishna, hi, Bob." So it takes courage to sensitize yourself to the suffering, to own the stress and suffering inside, but to really acknowledge the suffering of those around you. The more we begin to really sense what another person is feeling, the more we begin to recognize how their suffering is our suffering. And just as the neighbors saw this 81-year-old man hanging on a ladder cleaning the gutters, something in him responded that he wouldn't want his father or grandfather doing that, and the spontaneous rush to be of aid. It's such a beautiful thing because it breaks down our sense of a separate self. I'm gauging the time I have left, which is not long. So we'll close with a widening of circles, but I'd like to talk a little bit about how we respond to external suffering. And this has been a real part of my practice for quite a while. How do I serve a world that is endlessly suffering? In some way, I hope I can do that through my offerings, through kind of what I do, through my talks and through programs and retreats, to create what I really feel is like a practice that really can lead to very, very deep freedom inside. But also when I just sense the planet that's under so much stress right now. What can I personally do? Part of it for me is realizing it's around using less resources. Kind of aware of the impact that I have on travel. Another way that I have really kind of sensed my relationship to suffering is how I eat. And again, I've talked about this before, I won't belabor it, but having grown up on a farm and worked on farms and been part of the meat production industry, that when I allow myself to feel the suffering of the victims of that industry, of animals that have no voice, I allow myself to feel it, it's kind of unbearable, personally. And it gets very heightened because I was an active, kind of unconscious participant in that for so many years. And so I really asked myself, is there a way I can respond? And for me, as I've, over actually many years, explored being more plant-based, it's actually a really good feeling. I realized that the average American will eat 7,000 animals in their lifetime. And just that way of sensing suffering and sensing what can I do has been personally very, very helpful for me. So when you undertake the training to cultivate more compassion, there has to be a willingness to feel more, to kind of soften the shell of self-protection. And back when I was living in Africa, I was reading a book. Actually, I was reading a book on generosity. It was a Christian book on generosity, and someone came to the door, and this guy, he was telling me he was from Sierra Leone, and he was in the bus station. He was really, really sick, and he was at the bus depot, and someone beat him up and stole all his money. And he showed me his X-ray of this cancer that he had. And then he started coughing, and he coughed up blood. And he said his father was a rancher in Sierra Leone, and if there's any way I could help him, he would get the money back to me. I was so taken by his story, and it was just so real and so visceral. And I was reading right at that time that whatever anyone asks you, double it, just as an act of faith. And so he asked me for whatever it took to get home. I forget how much money it was, and I doubled it, and I gave it to him, and he went on his way, and I felt really good about it. And about a week later, there was a notice that came around the office that said, if there's a guy who comes up to your door and tells you that he's from Sierra Leone and that he has cancer and was beaten up at the bus station, do not give this guy any money, because what he was doing was biting his lip and then made it look like he was coughing up blood. But it was really interesting because I really got that my heart's response was naive, but it was pure. And there was a purity to it. So when it comes to exploring generosity and cultivating that quickening of the heart to suffering, there are a few things I think that are really important. One of the errors that you can run into is forgetting to fill your cup first. I see this so often for people who are caretakers. You know, they're taking care of someone who's really sick in their family, and they're burning out like crazy. And they can't give themselves permission to stop or take care of themselves. It's so easy to go into self-denial when you sense the suffering around you. So remembering to fill your cup, that you have to feel full from the inside. One of my teachers, who's really quite a radiant guy, and he talked about this. He said, on a good day, I'm like a rain cloud. I am so saturated and so full that the rain just falls. And he said, and that's what we need to do, is to ensure that we are filled so you can give without effort, so that you can give with that sense of spontaneity. The second pitfall that we can run into is to take on too much of the pain. That when you begin to sense the suffering of those around you, it's very easy to get very identified with it and kind of get pulled into it. I devoted a lot of time many, many years ago into developing my skill as a hands-on healer. I learned lots of different techniques. And in the very beginning, I thought, what I need to do is really feel the person's pain so I can really respond to it. That was a really bad idea, because I was getting way too sensitized and sometimes kind of unable to respond because I was so kind of pulled into their pain. So to be aware that when you're overwhelmed by the suffering around you, again, your effectiveness to respond to it will be compromised. So it's very helpful to recognize when you need to step back and when you need to refresh. Another part of that, another pitfall, is really when we forget the balance of the two wings of the practice. One wing is wisdom, it's seeing clearly, seeing into the nature of reality. The other wing is this cultivating the heart that can hold what you see. If you look solely at life through the wing of wisdom without compassion, life is very cold. You can see into the nature of karma and cause and effect very, very clearly. But without empathy and compassion, it's very dry. But if you're looking at life solely through the lens of compassion without wisdom, then you'll be overrun. Then you will feel your energy drain, and you will forget that one of the roles of suffering in life is to reveal the lessons we need to learn. So when you forget that you cannot learn another person's lessons for them, that becomes a pitfall. So it's really, really subtle. If you've ever been with someone who is working with a really deep addiction, what is the most compassionate response? To give them money? To give them empathy? To help them in some way to move through the crisis that they're in? This is the wise heart. I feel your suffering. I can't learn your lesson for you. How can I help? It becomes a very powerful part of the practice. I'm not a parent, and I can't imagine what it's like to be a parent, to allow your kids to learn their own lessons. And I see now kind of back, when I was a kid, we kind of had a reverse curfew. You couldn't come home until a certain time of the day. And when I was a kid, it was like, you do your chores and dinner's at 6, And so I did a lot of really stupid things as a kid. Growing up on a farm, I had free and plentiful access to knives and guns and bows and arrows and sometimes explosives. You know what M80s are? You can do a lot of interesting things with M80s. Thank God I survived. But on the other hand, I learned a lot by making a lot of mistakes. So it's that balance of the wise heart. The example I give, I can't think of a better one, is when you meet a 15-year-old who's madly in love, and their heart is going to be mincemeat, but you wouldn't take that experience away. That's kind of an initiation and a growing up. That, to me, is the wise heart. To really recognize we're all learning our lessons, and at the same time, to keep our hearts open to that. And someone once asked a little while ago, is there more suffering now on the planet than before? On the one hand, there have been some studies, there's fewer wars than ever, there's less violence than ever. But ultimately, I think that question doesn't really help, because there is suffering, and there has always been suffering. And the question is, how do we relate to suffering, given that it's a part of this human journey? So I'd like to close with a short little meditation. You might again just sense the breath. And in your own way, just sensing what it means to cultivate a heart that can hold this whole life. And a few questions to consider. When you sense the challenges, the personal challenges in your life right now, when you sense the challenges your loved ones may be going through, and the external turmoil in the world, how can you keep your heart open? What does radical self-care look like to you? When you sense the inner circle of your life, your family, your friends, your coworkers, what do you need to stay alive and present and thriving? When you imagine going through your day, the people you see every day, how can you keep your heart awake and present? And when you sense these turbulent times we're in right now, how can you be present to all of this without losing your connection to presence? An integral part of this path is committing to stay awake and present. And we'll close with this reading from Diane Ackerman. It's called School Prayer. In the name of the daybreak and the eyelids of morning and the wayfaring moon and the night when it departs, I swear I will not dishonor my soul with hatred, but offer myself humbly as a guardian of nature, as a healer of misery, as a messenger of wonder, as an architect of peace. In the name of the sun and its mirrors, and the day that embraces it, and the cloud veils drawn over it, and the uttermost night, and the male and the female, and the plants bursting with seed, and the crowning seasons of the firefly and the apple, I will honor all life, wherever and whatever form it may dwell, on earth my home, and in the mansions of the stars. And in these final moments, you might just reflect if there is someone in your life who may be struggling or challenged or under stress. And as you reflect on them, just sense the response of the heart. Is there a sense of what they might need or what they might want, and how you might respond through an action of some kind? And if you were to do that, what would that feel like? What would that be like inside? And as you're ready, you can deepen your breath. And as you're ready, you can open your eyes. Thank you so much for coming out tonight. May you and your heart have a great evening together. There was a request for a talk on Ram Dass, so I'm going to give a little talk on Ram Dass and his life next week, which should be a lot of fun. Have a great night. Thank you.